Okay, let's take a look at Parshas Chukas. Tomorrow, in 2 days, is the yahrzeit of Bat Sheva Blima Bat Harav Moshe Yosef Halevi. Will dedicate the shir in her memory. In this week's Parsha, we learn about the deaths of two very, very holy people, Aharon and Miriam. Now, why did Aaron die? Why did Aaron die in the desert? Does anyone know why? Why was Aaron denied entry into the promised land? I don't have it on your sheet over here, but it's an explicit verse in this week's Parsha. Does anyone remember the story of Mei Merivah? The story of the strife over the water. Miriam died, and the water was denied. In other words, the water flow that was coming miraculously to the Jewish people in the desert all of a sudden dried up. God told Moshe, speak to the rock. Moshe and Aaron present themselves to the people as a duet, as a pair of communal leaders. And whatever went wrong, whether it was Moshe hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, or speaking inappropriately to the people, there are a number of ways to understand the very nuanced sin that was committed by the leaders, but it was committed by the two of them in tandem, by Moshe and Aaron, because when Hashem says that I am displeased with how you comported yourselves, Hashem is speaking to Moshe and Aaron jointly, and he therefore says to them, the two of you will not gain access into the land of Israel. This is a punishment that is handed to both of them, to both Moshe and Aaron, for the sin of Mei Merivah, for the way they mishandled the events of regenerating water for the people when they were thirsty. Okay? So it's important for us to know that Aaron is dealt with explicitly in the Parsha. That Hashem tells Moshe and Aaron jointly, you are being punished for Mei Merivah and you will not get into Eretz Yisrael. So the very same thing that caused Moshe to be denied entry into Eretz Yisrael is the very same thing that caused Aaron. But we read about Aaron's death in this week's Parsha, and we don't read about Moshe's death until the very end of the Torah in Parshas V'zos HaBracha. But their punishment is the same. That's at least the surface explanation. I refer you to the Abarbanel, who suggests that there's other reasons why Moshe and Aaron are denied entry, but this is the simple understanding of the Psukim. We also read about Miriam's death. Her death is recorded before Aaron's death because she dies, and as a result of her death, if you take a look, the Torah says at the beginning of chapter 20, Vayavohu b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbartzin b'chodesh harishon. All of b'nei Yisrael came to the Tzin desert during the first month. Well, the first month of what? First month of what year? We don't even know what year it is. It just tells us it's in the first month. So the commentaries explain very clearly that we've done a fast forward from last week's Parsha. This Parsha deals with the 40th year of the Jews' sojourn in the desert. They are getting very close at this point to the border of Eretz Yisrael, but they're not there yet. They come to the Tzin desert, which is just east of Eretz Yisrael, and Vayeshev ha'am b'Kadesh, the people dwell in a place called Kadesh. Vatomos sham Miriam vatikaver sham. Miriam dies, and she is buried there. Now, right afterwards, in the very next pasuk, v'lo hayamayim la'eda, there was no water for the congregation, immediately after Miriam's death. So as Rashi tells us, Mikan, this is in source number 2, Mikan shekol arba'im shana haya lahem ha'be'er bizchut Miriam. This teaches me that for all 40 years that the Jews were in the desert, the water came to them in the merit, in the zuchus of Miriam. Now, why specifically in the zuchus of Miriam? Well, we'll have to get to that in just a second. But Miriam's righteousness was what made the people deserving of water. So, my question is very simple. We know why Moshe died before seeing the promised land. We know why Aaron died before seeing the promised land. But nowhere does the Torah tell us why did Miriam have to die before gaining entrance into Eretz Yisrael. What did she do to deserve to die before entering the promised land? By the way, this question is accentuated when we take a look at the words of our sages who tell us that it was only the men who participated in the Chet HaEgel, and it was again only the men who participated in the Chet HaMiraglim. So therefore, there were many, many women who made it into Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban tells us that even Moshe's mother, Yocheved, gained entry into Eretz Yisrael. She was 250 years old at the time. Was it she 250? One second. She was 130 when Moshe was born. Moshe was 120. Yeah, she was 250 years old when the Jewish people got into Eretz Yisrael. So it's an amazing miracle. The Medrash tells us this. But why not Miriam? Why not Miriam?
How old was Miriam at this time?
She's 123, 122, 123. Okay, because she's 3 years older than Moshe. Moshe is approaching 120. So she's got to be either 122 or 123. But I'm sure she didn't look a day over. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, so she dies. But the Torah doesn't tell us why she died. And what did she do? There is no apparent sin that is attached to Miriam. She didn't deserve to die before gaining entrance to the Promised Land, especially since they're so close. They're mamash, just a few months at most, away from Eretz Yisrael. So I want to bring to your attention something very interesting. There are two places where Rashi seemingly says exactly the same thing. If you take a look at Rashi's commentary on source number 1 in Pasuk Aleph, Rashi says, "Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah," that b'nei Yisrael, the entire congregation. So Rashi says, "Edah ha'shelema." We are dealing now in the 40th year when we are a complete Edah. The word Edah, by the way, is a congregation that is virtuous, not to be confused with Am. Am is just, a whole bunch of people of varied spiritual level. Edah really connotes a high level of righteousness among the congregation. Shekvar meitu metei midbar ve'elu parshu l'chayim. Because all of the people who had been condemned to die in the desert because of the sin of the spies, by this time had already passed away. We're in the 40th year. Everyone who was supposed to die had already died. We're getting ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael. We are a complete Edah. Now, why is Rashi telling us this information?
Source is it?
Source number 1, Rashi. Source number 1 where it says Rashi. Yeah? So these people were preserved for life, and yet still they complained because there was no water for them to drink. So it could be that what Rashi is telling us is that this was not an illegitimate complaint that was lodged by inappropriate people. These were people were righteous, but there was no water because Miriam died. Now, if you take a look in Pasuk Chaf Beis after the events of Mei Meriva, the Torah tells us that when the Jews got their water back because Moshe either spoke to the rock or hit the rock or did a number of things to the rock to make it reflow with water, even though Miriam had already passed away, the Torah says, "Vayis'u mi kadesh, vayavo'u b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah hor hahar." Once again, the words kol ha'edah are mentioned in this pasuk. The Jews travel from Kadesh, and they come, the entire Edah, to Hor Hahar, a place called Hor Hahar. Again, Rashi says, kol ha'edah, kulam shleimim, va'omdim lihikanes la'aretz. They are all complete, ready to enter into the land. Shelo haya bahen echad me'otam shenigzera gzeira aleim shekvar kolu metei midbar. None of them had placed upon them the decree to die in the desert because those people had already perished. Ve'elu me'otan shekatuv bahen chayim kulechem hayom. And therefore, all of the people that are traveling now are among those about whom Moshe pronounced, you are all alive. None of you are destined to die before we make it in. We're all going to make it in. Now, Rashi seemingly says the exact same thing that he said before, that we are dealing with a point in the timeline of the sojourn in the desert where all the people that were supposed to die because of the sin of the Meraglim have already died. Why does Rashi have to say the same thing once in Pasuk Aleph and again in Pasuk Chaf Beis? That is our question of the day. Why is it necessary to repeat this point that anyone who had to die had already died? There could be a number of answers to this question, but I'd like to show you something from the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer of the early 19th century. And he writes as follows. Source number 4. Vayavo'u b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbartzin. Piresh Rashi, Eda shalema shekvar metu anshe hador, v'hem elu muchanim likanes la'eretz Yisrael. So first quotes Rashi on Pasuk Aleph. They were a complete congregation. No one was decreed to die. V'shuv gabe hor hahar ketiv, vayavo kol ha'eda hor hahar. Chazar Rashi upiresh kol ha'eda shlema, elu kulam porshim lechayim v'aleim ktiv chayim kulechem hayom. Rashi says seemingly the exact same thing. Why does Rashi have to say the same thing once in Pasuk Aleph and once in Pasuk Chaf Beis? So he says like this, and this is the 5th line in this text. V'nira li b'ta'am mitat Miriam. It would seem to me that this will help us understand why Miriam died. L'chaper al ha'eda, to atone for the congregation. Achar shekvar metu miraglim, because after all, the spies and all those who participated with them had already passed away. V'chol ha'eda shleimim likanes la'eretz Yisrael. Everyone who's left does not deserve to die because of the sin of the spies. But al kol panim hutzruchu kapara sheyiyu re'uyim likanes. But just because they were no longer stigmatized by the sin of the spies does not mean that they automatically deserve to go into Eretz Yisrael. There were other stains on the Jews who had traveled in the desert for those 40 years. Okay, so you were not 20 years old when the spies came back. You were not part of that chevra that cried that night of Tisha B'Av and ended up having the decree placed on you that you will never get into the promised land. You were a teenager when all of that happened. And so therefore you are not being punished. You don't deserve that punishment of the spies. But what makes you worthy to go into the promised land? What about all of the other things that have happened along the way when you kvetched and complained and showed lack of faith? There's something else that is needed in order to make you worthy for entry into Eretz Yisrael. So, umeita hatzadeket lechaper al avon ha'eda. Miriam therefore died to provide atonement to all of the other wrong that was committed by that generation, which would therefore give them the ability, with now this clean sheet through the death of Miriam, to enter into Eretz Yisrael. Ume'ata, he says, and therefore, achar mitat hatzadeket hayu kulam mehanemar vatem hadvekim chayim kulchem hayom. And that's the reason why Moshe says it again. Yes, it's true. In the first pasuk, Rashi says that these people did not participate in the sin of the spies, but they were still not worthy yet of entry into Eretz Yisrael. We have this concept, and we've talked about it before when we read in the Kuzari, when we studied the passage of Jeremiah 53, the suffering servant, if you remember, that sometimes when righteous people die, they can atone for the sin of their entire generation. So Miriam's death was a way of martyrdom of her death atones for the sins of her entire generation and makes them all worthy of entry into Eretz Yisrael. This is the reason, according to the Chassam Sofer, that even though the Torah never tells us that Miriam did anything wrong, she still needed to die in order to allow the rest of Klal Yisrael to gain entry into Eretz Yisrael. It's a very difficult concept to appreciate, but yet that's what Miriam dies without sin. She dies in order to atone for the sins of her entire generation. Yes?
But would Moshe and Aaron's death atone for all these people, or would it not count because they sinned?
Moshe and Aaron's death provide some level of atonement, but because they're dying for their own sins, they're not dying a pure death, a death of complete righteousness that can work for other people as effectively as Miriam, who was without sin. So that's what the Chassam Sofer essentially is saying. Yes, Ricky?
To me, this just sounds very Jesus-y. So,
Well said. Okay.
yeah, so what exactly does dying do that magically erases their sins? Because if it just magically erases their sins, then it's almost like they're free to do whatever they want, because some righteous person might just die and save them.
Right. So, the commentaries say that when a righteous person leaves the world and others are affected by it, so it actually has a way of, it's almost like the idea that suffering purges sin. We believe on a general level that suffering purges sin. When the generation is subjected to the suffering of losing their great leader Miriam, losing a great tzaddiket, that in itself is a form of privation, and through that privation they get their sins alleviated. It's just like sickness. Sickness alleviates sin also. If a person goes through a very, very dire bout with illness, or a very great tribulation or challenge in life, and they're able to live through it, the pain itself helps to expunge sin. This is the painful experience of the death of a tzaddik. It works on metaphysical levels as well that we really can't quantify, but that's what it says. Anyway, so that's the concept. By the way, it sounds Jesus-y because they got it from us, not because we got it from them. But your point is well taken. But I'd like to suggest something else in the last few minutes that we have remaining. A couple of other ideas. And that is, number one, we have to also realize that Miriam's whole life was completely intertwined with Moshe Rabbeinu. There are certain times when a person's whole life purpose is directly linked with another person. Do you ever notice that there are some times in life when two people who were married for many, many years, sometimes one spouse will die, and then shortly thereafter the other one will pass away. I think that a lot of it has to do sometimes with mental anguish and the psychology of what happens going through the grief process. I think that might be part of it. But I think there's another part of it as well, that on a metaphysical level, sometimes two people's souls are so intertwined that once one person leaves the world, the other person also cannot linger for that much longer because their life was so much part and parcel of the other person's life. I remember this happened when Rav Simcha Wasserman passed away. So his almana, I think she died right at the end of the Shiva, or right after the Shiva for Rav Simcha, she too passed away. And it was really, and you find this in certain instances. Miriam's whole life was intertwined with her brother Moshe's from a very, very young age, where the Torah says, "Vatesatzav achaso merachok lede'a maye aselo." You could almost say that she was the trigger and the impetus for Moshe's birth, because according to the Gemara, Amram and Yocheved actually had divorced, because Amram didn't want to have any more children, knowing that the Egyptians were committing infanticide and killing all of the babies. But it was Miriam who was able to convince Amram to continue procreating and getting all of the Jewish community to continue having children. And Miriam herself, when Moshe was born, prophesied that he would become a great leader and be the redeemer of Israel. So when the Torah says that she stood by the bulrushes to see what would happen to him, she knew that he wouldn't die. She knew that there was something that was destined in this baby for greatness. And I think that perhaps, part of the reason why she passed away at this particular juncture is because her death is linked to Moshe Rabbeinu's death. Since Moshe is imminently going to die and not make it into Eretz Yisrael, it's altogether possible that Miriam's death is not because she needs to die as a punishment, but rather her life purpose has been fulfilled through Moshe's having lived a complete and full life and having accomplished his purpose. So once Moshe's purpose was accomplished, her purpose was accomplished in kind, and therefore their deaths are only days apart from each other, or at least weeks apart from each other. That could be one possibility. Another point I think that needs to be made is that a lot of times when people have accomplished their purpose, that is when Hashem is ready to take them from this world even without sin. Many times people leave the world without sin. They're not dying because they're being punished, they're dying because they've fulfilled their life purpose. There's a famous question that the commentaries ask, and that is, if the water came back in the merit of, if the water came back after Miriam died, doesn't that in itself indicate that Miriam was not necessary as the impetus for the water? In other words, our sages seem to contradict themselves. On the one hand, they say that the water only flowed in the desert in the zuchut of Miriam, like we saw Rashi quotes. And yet, after Miriam dies, if it really only flowed in her merit, why then did the Jewish people get the rock to flow continuously even after she died? It only stopped temporarily. So what happened? Like, in other words, if it's because of her and she's not around anymore, why then did they merit to get the water flowing again? Well, I think the answer is because what is it about Miriam that caused the water to flow in her merit? And it is, of course, because of her piety and righteousness. She herself was a flowing fountain of water. She was constantly there to provide for others and to provide to quench other people's thirst. When she saw others in need, she went ahead and provided for others. She acted as the leader in that sense to teach a community, an entire generation, how to do chesed, how to provide for others, how to be a wellspring of giving for other people. By the time she came to the end of her life, she succeeded in imparting that lesson to others. So whereas initially the slave class of Israel did not understand the idea of imparting and giving to other people because a slave doesn't know how to do that, by the time 40 years pass and they have looked up to Miriam for that inspiration, she has succeeded in that lesson to the entire nation. And as a result, the entire nation are now themselves an Eidah Shel Chesed, a congregation of kindness. So that, even though Miriam died and the water stopped temporarily to provide the people a lesson, but the lesson was, as long as you continue to emulate Miriam and live up to her standards of giving, the water can come back. So in that sense, Miriam's fountain is able to continue, even in her absence, because she has left a generation of disciples who emulate and follow in her footsteps, and in their merit, the water is able to come back. So in brief, there's a couple of ideas about the Miriam's death. The one idea that I wanted to point out is, like the Chassam Sofer says, that sometimes the death of the righteous is not because of sin, but rather to atone for the sins of others. And we learned about that in the Kuzari, which we won't go over again. The second idea is that since her life is so linked with Moshe, once Moshe's purpose is complete, then her purpose is complete. And finally, once her purpose of educating an entire generation of people to learn how to be that exemplar of kindness and flowing waters, she's ready to die because she's completed her life lesson. Okay, so I want to wish you all a healthy and happy summer, and we'll see you, we'll let you know, maybe we'll have a class before Tisha B'Av, so that we can get ready properly, and then we'll move forward. Okay?
Thank you.
Have a great day.